Hey friends, I am going to share today a tutorial on how to make a bow. Um, I have made a handful of these bows and they're so much fun. Here's a pink one. And I'm just going to walk you through how to make it. It's pretty easy. It is using half a yard of fabric by the full width of fabric and a little bit of ribbon, roughly about 12 to 18 inches of ribbon. So the bow ends up being about 10 inches wide at the top here. And from the top of the knot to the bottom of the tail, it's roughly 18 to 20 inches. So all it requires is a little bit of machine sewing, a little bit of hand sewing, and you can make these super cute bows. They're great for holiday decor, but they're also really great for everyday decor. Bows are super on trend right now. I have an 11-year-old daughter and she's all about bows. So hanging on a wall in a cute little art collage, hanging above a bed, hanging on a doorknob or on like like an end finial of a bed would be really cute. Hanging on garlands, going up a staircase or in the middle of any garland. They're just fun and cute decor. You can change the length of your hanger to however you would like. You could also have a hidden hanger by just sewing a little bow, a little loop or a little ribbon or a little wire around the back. So let's get into making these fun bows. If you make them, please share. I would love to see what you've made. The easiest way to do that is on Instagram and tag me, woollypetals, or shoot me an email or a link. That'd be awesome. Okay, so first you're going to take your fabric and cut 3 strips that are 5.5 inches tall by the width of the fabric. So if you've ever watched any of my other videos, you know I like to do I call it a registration cut, I guess, where you just make a nice straight line on one side. And from there, you are going to cut 3 5.5 inch tall strips. So with the fabric, this is folded in half on this edge. I have several piled up. And then 5.5 inches tall. So one strip, 5.5 inches tall. It is really helpful if you use non-directional fabric, because the way you cut this, it is horizontal cutting across the fabric, but it's going to hang down like this for the tails of the bow. Okay, last strip. So the last strip, you're not going to use the whole thing, but you do use a decent amount of it. Okay, I'm going to set these aside. I'll fold those up later. So I'll show you what to subcut from those in a minute. Then you are going to use batting. I actually typically use, this is Warm and Natural, and it's like their fluffier stuff. So it's like 50% thicker than their normal Warm and Natural. You can kind of play around with it about how thick you want it. You could just use one layer of batting. If your batting is thinner than what this is, you may want to do 2 thicknesses of batting within your bow top. We're only putting batting in the bow top. or the bow itself, not the tails that come down or the middle tab. So you're going to cut 12 inches wide is what I've found to look nice, by 5.5 inches tall again. So I'll have to cut one more of those, but that's okay. So we're going to make, I guess, the pink bow because it's pretty. So I'm going to grab all my pink pieces. And I will set all my other pieces aside if I get the chance to make some other bows. That is what those are for. Okay. So you have 3 width of fabric by 5.5 inches. For 2 of those, you are going to cut the tails. So we got to cut off our salvages, and we are going to be sewing these right sides together for 2 of them. So I like to put them right sides together because it just is helpful to me to cut it like this, like how it's going to be sewn. And we're going to cut this bottom corner off at, I use a 45-degree angle. It doesn't really matter what degree you cut it off at, just as long as it matches on either side. And just cut off from the bottom up. This is a 45-degree angle. You could also do a 60-degree angle, which is a little bit less of an angle and waste less fabric. And of course, there's a 30-degree angle, but that's pretty extreme. You could also, if you wanted to, leave it straight, or you could cut up to the middle and then back down. When you're stitching, all you have to do is follow that shape. So I'm going to just continue my 45-degree angle because that's what I practice on and I look good. The trick with this is that you want to keep these fabrics aligned, right sides together, and then you want to cut the same angle but opposite on the other side. So you see how I laid that over, and then I can actually just use the angle of this to cut instead of my ruler, so that you're doing it on the opposite. I guess it's not the opposite. It's kind of going in the opposite direction. Does that make sense when you turn it like this? So you can see how it looks. So I'm going to leave these right sides together. Feel free to pin. We are just going to sew around this with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm going to start and stop in the middle, leaving about a 2-inch opening should suffice. With our last 5.5 inch strip here, you want to cut a 12-inch wide piece. This is your bow piece. You have 2 of them actually. You want to cut 2 of them. I just had that folded over and cut them at the same time. And then you are actually going to put these right sides together and then place that directly on top of your batting. And we are going to sew around the edge, a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving about a 2-inch opening in the middle. And you can pin that in place on top. It is a little bit weird if you've never made a sandwich like this, to make sure to put your fabrics right side together, right next to each other, and then your batting on an outside. Doesn't matter which side. And then lastly, we want to cut our piece for our tie in the middle. These are all 3 separate parts: the tails of the bow part itself, and then this is the little piece that goes in the middle of the bow. And you can use the 5.5 inch wide piece. I want to cut about an 8-inch piece, and then you can adjust that if you need. We're going to sew that just in a tube. So you're going to put right sides together, the longest sides, and just sew a 1/4 inch. You don't have to backstitch on this because if you might trim it. If you end up not trimming it, backstitch. Just use a shorter stitch length so that when you do cut, you don't have to worry about any frayed edges. The last thing you're going to cut is some ribbon. So whatever ribbon you want, really. It's fun to kind of find different ones. I've just been using red. And this really is up to you how you want to hang it. The one that I cut before was probably about 18 inches. And this can be done after the fact. We're not stitching this on. until the end, and I just hand stitched it down, but you're just going to fold it in half. Typically I put it together so the fold is nice, and then I just knot the bottom, and then we're going to stitch it on after the bow is all made to the back to hang it up. You could also use wire on the back if you don't want to see a hanging tail, or a shorter tab as well. So like I said, it's kind of what you want to see, if that is a visible ribbon hanger or if it's a hidden ribbon hanger. So let's go to the sewing machine and sew up our 3 pieces. Okay, we're here at the machine. It's really just really straightforward piecing, and then we're going to do some hand stitching afterwards. This is our tube for the tab that goes in the middle of the bow. Again, I'm just folding in half the longest way and doing a 1/4 of an inch seam down that side. And I am just used to back stitching, so I typically do always back stitch. So we have our tube here, and we can just set that aside. Next, I have my long tail with my angled ends. So I'm gonna just start in the middle, and my pieces aren't super, oops, losing things all over the place, super perfect, but that's okay. Okay, so just start in the middle, leaving a couple inches opening. You can leave it as big as you want to turn it right side out, but if it's larger, you may have to just whip stitch it closed real quick. Just keeping the sides as even as possible. I do a back stitch and then just a 1/4 of an inch all the way around, adjusting if I need to put the edges closer to where they should be, but I want this to stay as flat and even as possible. When you get to about where it looks like the 1/4 of an inch would start on this side, you're going to leave your needle down, lift up your foot, and pivot it back around. You could go to the end, back stitch, and then start a new seam if you're not comfortable with that, but we want to clip off that end for when we turn it so the corner isn't full of excess fabric. We want that corner to look nice and crisp, so that is why I do it this way. So again, I get to about a 1/4 of an inch away from this edge because that's where we want our seam to be. And then I make sure my needle's down, lift my foot, and turn it. Just go all the way across. And it doesn't matter which side you start on as long as you start in the middle. I guess the goal is to keep those long lines as straight as possible. Coming to this corner again, needle down, lift, pivot. On my first bow, I did leave a larger opening here, so I know that I can go a little bit smaller. See, it's pretty small. It's whatever you're comfortable with because you do have to pull all the stuff through. But before we go on to the bow part, we're going to clip off our corners, and that is just clipping off that little bit. So when we turn it, all the seam fabric is inside the bow. And if we had left the corner, that extra fabric gets punched in that corner, and it makes it hard to get a nicer. It is kind of what it looks like. You don't want to be right next to the stitching, but close enough. We're just taking off that extra fabric. I do it on this corner too, just to be safe. But again, there's a still solid 1/16 of an inch between the edge of the fabric and the seam. Don't forget to do your opposite corners. And you can set that aside. Lastly, don't forget we have our bow sandwich, right sides together, 12 by 5.5. Then with the same size batting, put on the exterior of those 2 fabrics. And we are going to sew around, pivoting at the corners again. Again, I want to do a 2-inch roughly opening in the middle. The center is key because that middle section is hidden under the bow, like the tie part. And so it produces less work for us if we can keep those openings small in the center. you can see that when I get to the corner, and you can measure too if you're more comfortable, if you aren't sure what a 1/4 of an inch looks like, measure in from each corner so that you know where to pivot before you start sewing. And you want to make sure you catch that batting in all your seams. It's possible you might not catch it or you might get close. As long as we catch it, that's great. This one is even a little bit big, so I might even trim that off a little bit. Not a big deal. Once it's turned right side out, it'll all be able to iron out. We're going to clip these corners again. Same thing, close to the stitching, not right next to the stitching, cutting at an angle to get as much of that excess fabric so those points can stay nice and crisp when we go to the other side. So now what we're going to do is we're going to turn all these pieces right side out. So for this one, it's the only one that is a little bit different because we have 3 layers. We want that batting to stay inside of the 2 fabrics. So make sure when you go through the opening, you are going in between the right sides of the fabric. And so the batting, once it's turned, will be in between those 2 right sides. The 2 outside fabrics, I guess. So it is a little bit harder with that tiny little hole, but I did more hand stitching on my first version, and I'm trying to see if a smaller hole can get rid of that hand stitching process. You can see this isn't hard. As long as you backstitch at the beginning and end of that hole, you should be fine without popping stitches. Worst case, if you pop a few stitches turning, just do a little whip stitch. I use my scissors and very gently push out those corners. You want to use something pointed, and as long as my scissors and I are in control, I can use them without any problem or any poking through the fabric. So I'm just poking out these 4 corners to get a nice crisp bow corner. It's hard to tell, but the fabric on the inside, the seam allowance, I want that to be on the back of my bow. So the more fluff and batting are on the front, and that seam allowance, when you sew this, you'll be able to tell what I mean because you can kind of see the seam allowance popping up here, but on the front you have a nice smooth finish. So just keep that in mind when you're sewing your bow into the bow for which side faces the front. Okay, so now we have our long tails, and we are doing the exact same thing. We are just turning it right side out. There are tube turners for stuff like this, or you can use a dowel. You just want to be careful not to stretch or hurt the fabric when doing that. And these are wide enough that I don't really feel a tube turner is overly necessary. And a tube turner is great for when it's a skinnier tube. You can also use, like I have this long ruler that I keep handy and I use. And once you get it kind of turned, it may help kind of push some of those ends out. So as I'm kind of pushing, it's helping push the fabric. But again, this is such a large piece of fabric that to me, you can just use your hands until you get to these points at the end. And then you might want to use the scissors or a dowel to poke out that little tail point to get nice and sharp. Let's go through our little hole opening here. And I like to crisp out this less angled corner. Let's find it there. Because when we go to the iron, we want to have nice corners that we can iron out. And then just being gentle because the scissors are sharp and they work well when there's no excess, when there's excess little like seam allowance fabric to butt them into so they don't poke through the fabric. So there's one corner, and we're going to take it to the ironing board and really iron those seams nice so that it stays really flat. But first, I do want to just poke out the other side to make sure everything is as easy as possible when we get to the ironing board. Again, just take your time. I use a long dowel sometimes too to do this because until I get to the very end where I do want something pokey like the scissors, just if you're not used to it or you want to make sure you don't poke your scissors through the fabric, because that has happened to me. So now we have our long sash, and then the last thing is just the little tube for the tie, and that is very easy to poke through to be opposite. Okay, so let's go to the ironing board with our 3 sewn and turned pieces. Okay, here we are. I'm going to start with the tie, and I'm just going to make sure to iron the seam allowance flat. I'm putting that seam in the middle of the back so that it's completely hidden on the bow. Sometimes I forget the little legs on my ironing board or iron have to go. So that's my little tie. And then I'm going to work, let's do the bow first. So I like to iron on the side that's going to face forward, just making sure that those seams are nice and pushed all the way out so there's no creases, and just making it as nice and flat as possible. The only exception for this is when you get to the opening. Sometimes I do iron that opening before I sew. And sometimes I just iron the little parts separately, because it can be a little, you want it to look like a seam, and it can be a little tricky with that batting in there. So making it as straight as possible. And if you have a small opening and it will be hidden by our tie, you could just do a little top stitch across there to keep that closed. If you have a larger opening or think you'll see it, you can do like the ladder stitch across there for an invisible closure. So I'll actually show you on the bow an invisible closure hand stitched, and then I'll show you just a topical stitch on this sash part on the tails to close that one, because I do like to close them just so it's nice, all nice and crisp. So I'm just making sure my seam is like as far out as it will go, so there's no like creases. Sometimes if you don't push your seam out far enough, it gets kind of like a weird crease of fabric there, and I'm trying just to make sure that point is really nice. And then you can just go, oh, that's hot, my fabric is hot. You can just go across the rest of the bow doing that same thing, just kind of making sure that the seam is all the way out to the edge so you don't get any built up fabric in that crease. So we have all of our parts ironed nicely. Let's go back to the machine, do a quick whip stitch, and then a top stitch on these openings, and then we will assemble the whole piece. Don't forget to have the hanger if you don't have that already cut. Okay. The other thing, that I should have probably said to do with the ironing machine is on one end of this, like the knot tie, you could fold it over just like 1/2 inch or so and iron that in place. You don't really have to iron it, but I do like to fold it over for when we sew everything together. It gives it a nice finished look. So needle and thread, I almost always use white. You could match your fabric so it's 100% hidden, but I'm just going to do a quick little ladder stitch down this fabric, and I often have to catch my knot so that the knot doesn't come through the fabric. So I start it at one end, and then just having those edges that are open folded in like a seam would look, I just ladder stitch across. And I should know this, but I just call it a ladder stitch because I'm going in one fold, down maybe 1/8 of an inch, and then out the same fold. And then directly across from that, in the other fold, I'm going in and doing the same stitch repeated. So to me, those stitches are like the rungs of a ladder. It's a little bit different than a whip stitch because a whip stitch you typically don't go straight across from each other. You go at a diagonal and it's more visible. I use this ladder stitch for everything. This is the stitch that I use to do my binding. Anytime I have to close things because I want it to look like a finished seam. And the reason I'm showing this to you on the bow is because it's a little bit fluffier, so it's a little bit easier when you have a little bit wider crease with that batting underneath. We'll do a top stitch with the machine on the long tails, and you can see what that looks like too. So when you get to the other side, I just like to do like a little knot, pull it through the middle of the fabric. And I do that maybe 2 or 3 times depending on how tight it feels. And then I typically put my needle in, come through my layers, come up later in that seam, pull that knot in, and then clip off the thread. That buries your thread and helps prevent anything from coming out. So that is a ladder stitch to close the opening on the bow if you want to. Again, we're going to be tying this around, so it may be closed. The other option is to do a top stitch on your machine. I have white thread. I don't really mind it not blending in, but just where my opening is from end to end, I'm just going to do as close to the edge as I can get a top stitch with a back stitch to close that opening, just so there's no gaping or worrying about as I'm putting everything together. Okay, so that's a top stitch on the opening. Not too bad of a look. What I'm going to do next is I want to mark the middle of my tails here. And just I'm folding it in half, and then I'm putting a pin in the crease. And because you could also iron it to hold that crease, but because I want to know my crease all the way across, I'm just going to do 2 pins. So that marks the exact middle for me. It's so close to the crease of the fabric, which is fine because that crease of the fabric from coming off the bolt will be hidden in the bow. But it's a little bit off because of the salvages. And I'm going to do the same thing for this one, which is the bow. Okay, so I start with the bow and I want to do a long running stitch down where those pins are. And then I'm going to tie it off to cinch it all up and gather it. And then we're going to use the thread again, but separately to do that to the tails. And then without cutting the thread from the tails, we're going to sew everything together. So I just tend to use the same thread that is on my machine, and I just pull it off from my bobbin. Okay, I have a threaded needle. The only thing I would highly recommend is having the thread go through the needle, have the ends meet, and then you knot the ends together. So you essentially have 2 strands of thread. Because we're doing gathering and we want this to be the construction and holding together of our piece, that is why we do that. And when I'm stitching the first stitch, I'm just going to go in the end here. It doesn't have to look pretty. This is all going to be hidden, but I'm going to catch my knot at the end because otherwise we're going to be tugging this thread to gather, and sometimes that knot can come through the stitches otherwise. And then just follow that needle line, big gathering stitches, which is just a big running stitch. They're like roughly 1/2 inch apart. You could make them smaller, but the size and consistency of your stitches kind of tell you that's the gathers. So doing stitches that are even and evenly spaced and all the same size will give you nicer gathers. And then we're just going to gather this up. You can gather it as little or as much as you want. I tend to gather it maybe to about a half. And then I'm going to actually knot this together at the top. I'm going to put my thread through where my top knot is, and then I'm going to kind of be able to finish pulling it tight. making sure it looks about right for what I want. And then I'm going to knot that thread because we want to keep all of that gathered fabric where it is. And you might just have to hold it. See how my hand over here, is holding it in place, because until you get it knotted a couple times, it may loosen. I'm going to clip that tail. What I did is just I went through the fabric like I was doing a little stitch in the same place, and then I put my needle through the loop and tied a knot as I was pulling that stitch straight. I did that 2 or 3 times, and then I cut it off. We're going to do the same thing on our tails, but we are not going to cut after our tails are gathered. I started at the top, and you want your tails to look like this. So essentially, this shorter end of this point is the bottom. So start at the top middle, loop your loop your thread through just like before, where you're going to put it in between the 2 threads and hit the knot, like so it's in between the knot, and then pull it tight. And then this one, you could go a little bit smaller for your gathers. This is less noticeable for the way the folds are, because it's scrunched a little bit more behind and it doesn't have the batting in it. So you can do big loose stitches, or you can do small tiny stitches. The bigger, looser stitches will gather easier though. And then we're going to gather that up. And we're actually, what I like to do is just do a knot at the bottom to keep those gathers like kind of where they should be. So right where the last thread comes out, just do another stitch or 2 in there with your knot, and that kind of holds the gathers in place. And now we're going to stitch everything together, which is why I'm not cutting this thread. So we have our bow. So you should have a distinct side to it, this side or that side. And then we have our tail, which we want to make sure we align properly on the back of our bow. And just kind of play around with it. You definitely want those tails to like lay nicely and look nice. So kind of play around with how they lay and how they fall, and then hold it together. And then I just like to stitch it a little bit together on the back. So because I have my string still attached at the bottom, the string is on the sash or the tails, I'm just going to kind of loop the bow and the tails together at the bottom there, just to knot it together to kind of sort of attach it. I'm only going through those back layers. And then we can put our tie across. So this is the back, and you can pin everything in place if that helps you. I still haven't cut off that thread, and this is up to you. You could totally cut off that thread so it's not attached. I'm going to put this tie underneath with the seam facing up because we want it to be hidden. I'm going to place that bow on top of it, pull our thread kind of out to the side here. To attach the hanger, you want to put the knot, the bow wrapped around, and I want to look at the front of the bow. Does that look about right? Do I want to pull this knot several times, a little bit tighter? Knot the thread when you're done to keep it nice and sturdy and in place on the Once it's sewn, you can kind of scrunch that little middle up a little bit, and it kind of gives it a nice little look to it. Once we get like how tight we kind of want this tie to be, we are going to actually take the end of our tail, and we're going to take the raw edges and stuff it in the folded over edge of that, so we get a nice finished look on the back. And then kind of hold it in place. And then we have our thread, and right now it's under the tie. I'm just going to stick my needle under there and kind of come up in this spot down here, because I want to stitch those ties together. So I want to make sure that this is all stitched together and not going to come apart. And that I'm just going to do a running stitch across just through it. And I'm going to even grab some of the tails, maybe some of the bow if I can get all the way through. Just going across just to connect everything. Get as many of the layers without going through to the front as you can. And this makes your whole bow stay together. So we get to the edge here. We've sewn it all together. I'm going to do a little knot here. And then and the key with that knot is to make sure the fabric you're grabbing is as little as possible so that knot stays. And then I'm going to put my needle through the back again, and I'm going to come up in the middle because we want to hang our tie. So first I'm just going to double check everything looks good in the front. We have our tails hanging down. They're facing the right direction. We've got our tie around our bow, and like I said, once it's sewn on the back, you can kind of scrunch it up in the middle there and make it cute however you'd like. And then I'm just going to sew on the hanger for the bow. The weight of where that tie is attached is how it's going to kind of hang. And the nice thing is that these are typically hanging against a wall. You can kind of play with the tie here and kind of do what you want. But there's your bow. It ends up being about 10 inches across, maybe 11, and then about 20 inches from the top of the bow to the bottom of the point. Okay, so we have the lovely little hanger. The bow looks very nice. You can fluff this up a little bit more, but it's just a nice kind of sweet way to add some cute bow decor to your daughter's room, to your room, for the holidays, however you like.